Good morning or good afternoon, wherever you are. My name is Adam Clements. I'm a former U.S. diplomat and official at the Pentagon. I'm retired from the U.S. Army, and thank you very much for having me today to discuss American perspectives of Yemen in the media and also U.S. policy regarding Yemen. I'd like to begin by highlighting traditional U.S. interests and objectives in the Middle East and how Yemen may intersect with some of those interests and perspectives. And these are no particular order, but traditionally the United States has been interested in the free flow of commerce, of economic goods and services through the waterways of the Middle East, the Bab el-Mandeb, Straits of Hormuz, Suez Canal. Next, part of that, and the same could it be intersect with this free flow of commerce is also the free flow of oil and petroleum resources. Next, interest in Israel. Israel as being a place that traditionally and originally the U.S. supported Israel because it was fighting other countries in the region that the Soviet Union supported. So the beginning of the U.S. Support for Israel is sometimes forgotten or misunderstood, but that's the reason why the U.S. began supporting Israel several decades ago, because it could support and be a counterweight to Soviet military support in the region. And lastly, counterterrorism, of what we've seen expand definitely since 2001 and the attacks in the United States on September the 11th. And so within that context, where Yemen is seen often in U.S. media, and I mentioned in the counterterrorism standpoint, if many will remember in history, the attack on the USS Cole, and also of Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, and some of the U.S. counterterrorism operations that have taken place over several decades. I think many in the U.S. and media recognize the Straits of Hormuz and the Suez Canal, but often many forget that the Bab el-Mandeb is the gateway and the access point for approaching the Suez Canal. And so I think these are some of the things that some of the U.S. audience may remember and some others may forget. Other perspectives that in U.S. media may remember is many generations, especially older generations, will remember the 1979 Iranian Revolution and the hostages and that situation that took place. Many remember in the 1970s oil embargoes and the high cost of fuel and gasoline. And of course, the ongoing conflicts, particularly the past year, the horrible conflicts that have been going in the Middle East. And I think a lot of American audience has much more of an understanding of historically Iraq, for example, because the United States was in Iraq through its invasion of Iraq, separately from the Middle East, but related, and the counterterrorism is in Afghanistan, and the U.S. also understanding more of what's happening, the dynamic in Israel and the countries that it is traditionally its neighbors in Egypt and Jordan, and the conflict in Syria, Lebanon most recently, and the Gulf states. Of course, President Trump in his first foreign visit went to Riyadh. So all these are part of the American media experience and what's presented to a lot of American viewers. I believe that a lot of Americans don't understand or understand much at all about Yemeni culture, history, the geographic importance of the region, the history, the rich history. And so I think these are ways in which rather that Middle Eastern media or other think tanks or academic institutions continue to engage the American audience. And of course, a big part of this also is the Arab American and Yemeni American audience that is in the United States. That being said, I'll turn to some of the U.S. policies and perspectives of the Yemen conflict and what's taken place. And I'd like to start by a certain, at least contextually, understand the conflict the way that the United States has approached Yemen. I think, as many will remember, that the United States chose to limit its confrontation in the past decade of Yemeni conflict between the Saudi-led coalition and the Houthi movement. Of course, as many will recognize, that the U.S. continued to support Saudi Arabia and trying to professionalize its Air Force and providing some level of information and weapon systems so that the Saudi-led coalition could conduct its war against the Houthis, and this began under the Obama administration. I think that under the Trump administration, then this context, or this what we described of this support to the Saudi-led coalition, was a very we could say a lightning rod of criticism for the administration on the Congress. The Congress is very critical of the U.S. support for the Saudi-led coalition due to the civilian casualties that were taking place in Yemen as a result of airstrikes. I think also because of the humanitarian situation. And so I saw very clearly a lot of criticism of the Trump administration, and frankly as well going back as far as the Obama administration as well. And so I think when the Biden administration came into office, this context is important when President Biden was very critical of support for Saudi Arabia in its war effort against Yemen. There are other contextual factors there as well with the Khashoggi incident and murder. And so there are other contextual factors as well at play. But I think positively in the years leading up to the Biden administration coming into office, there's some changes in Saudi Arabia and some changes in Yemen that were very helpful, I think, overall. And now finally how the Biden administration has reapproached Saudi Arabia as hopefully a partner in trying to find a solution to arguably a very important global issue in creating more stability in the Arabian Peninsula and creating more stability specifically in Yemen. I think another incident in this same time period that's very important to this discussion of Washington and its engagement with the Yemen conflict is in 2019, the attacks on Saudi petroleum infrastructure, where the U.S. did not rush tens of thousands of forces and bomber groups to support Saudi Arabia. And I think this, along with Mohammed bin Salman and other Saudi Arabia's decision to refocus many of its diplomatic and its economic power and refocusing on Vision 2030, and that being a focus against this costly war in Yemen. In that context, that brings us to today of some of the assessments that I see for an incoming Trump administration. And I think a couple of things are very important here in this context. The first one being, first and foremost, when the first Trump administration came into office, the context was very different. There were no conflicts. There's not a conflict between Russia and Ukraine. And you also didn't have the conflict in Gaza and the conflict in Lebanon. And so I think this contextually is going to be very important of how the administration approaches Yemen, because the Yemen conflict has now expanded outside of what was just a more compartmentalized conflict with Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates and their military operations inside of Yemen, to now expanding regionally, to affecting the regional narrative, to affecting the conflict in Gaza. I think that the Houthis have definitely become a more regional player, and they're feeding on this regional narrative, and that's empowering them. So I think first and foremost, as we approach U.S. policy options and priorities, priority number 1, 2, 3, and etc. in the Middle East has to be to stop the conflict in Gaza and in Lebanon. Absent this and these conflicts, this removes part of the power of the Yemeni narrative, of the narrative specifically that the Houthis have used to consolidate a lot of their domestic constituencies, to consolidate others around their narrative, around their flag. It's part of their justification for their actions. And definitely you can see many of the justifications of these actions in their media engagement and their goals regionally. And so I think that's of primary importance. Next, from a U.S. perspective, I think there are resources. We need to talk about resources. As I mentioned at the beginning, at the beginning of the first Trump administration, the conflict in Ukraine didn't exist, and the conflict in Gaza and Lebanon with Israel, with Hezbollah and Iran did not exist. These conflicts have been tremendously taxing and used many global resources that the U.S. would have or could have used elsewhere in the world, notably in great power competition with China. And I think the administration will have to examine very closely, specifically the Pentagon will have to examine how these resources are used, how they've been consumed in these conflicts, and how American and European industries try to reconstitute or rebuild these resources that were consumed in these conflicts. Next, I think that's added to the conflict is with Israel as a part that fuels the Yemeni or the Houthi rather narrative. I think Israel, that the Houthis facing Israel, the Houthis facing the United States and the United Kingdom, who's participated in some of these strikes, absolutely feeds their narrative of what they've been saying for many, many years, and it's emboldened them. This is in the context of how the Houthis have been emboldened by surviving the conflict against the Saudis and against the United Arab Emirates. And so I think these narratives are tools, and the Houthis have been effective in weaponizing these narratives for their own gains and their own image. I think also the U.S. needs to look at a few things that have changed. In the past, the Houthis were not a threat directly against the United States. In Yemen, Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula was, or had been, a direct threat against the United States, had threatened the homeland of the United States. Now the Houthis have targeted other strategic interests in the United States of threatening global waterways. And so the question is for the U.S. administration, how can it prevent the Houthi movement from expanding some of its reach to perhaps in the future threatening the U.S. homeland and more interest as well? I think also the United States should look at how it does not do any worse. There are ways, I will say that many administrations, or just the natural nature of the Pentagon, of the State Department, of other elected officials sometimes, is to do something. And sometimes if they do something, this could be worse than not doing anything at all. And so I think there's a balance here that the incoming Trump administration will have to use as it reevaluates its approach. I'm not doing any worse, specifically of not creating more opportunities to fuel the Houthi narrative. Secondly, of not fueling the humanitarian disaster that is in Yemen, that has existed for many years, and that the administration does not normalize the conflict, that doesn't normalize the humanitarian situation. Next as well, I think that we should look at the appointees, the other members of the Trump administration cabinet, of who he brings back to his cabinet as specifically as a Secretary of State, as a Secretary of Defense, and other cabinet members at the White House. Notably, for example, Senator Marco Rubio has been hawkish, very hawkish against Iran, and he has a history of this. And there have been others in the Trump administration, and the performance of the Trump administration in its quote-unquote maximum pressure campaign of its objectives of trying to pressure Iran. Now, however, as I stated earlier, there are still those needs or maybe desires from a policy standpoint, but there are different pressures from a resource standpoint of what resources can be used or what have been diverted away from the Indo-Pacific, from the Pacific region that could have been used and that have been in turn used in the conflicts in the Middle East or Ukraine and Russia. And so I think this will be a big challenge that the Iran hawks will have to balance of what's more important. Is it more important to devote resources towards countering China or to continue to consume a lot of resources in the Middle East? And so as solutions, I like to use a paradigm that in the military is often used, and it's called DIME: diplomatic, information, military, economic. And then at the end, I'll add on H for humanitarian effects and affairs. I think for solutions from a diplomatic standpoint, I think that the U.S. should try to, as much as possible, to return to empowering diplomatically the Saudis to come to the forefront of diplomatic efforts to try to resolve this conflict, or at least be the face of presenting and having more interface in Yemen. I think the more that the U.S. can sit back and be behind the scenes, I think it's better that it doesn't fuel the narrative that the Houthis have used against the United States. I think that absolutely the U.S. Special Envoy and Tim Leonard King still needs to still be empowered, along with U.S. diplomats at the Yemen Affairs Unit, the U.S. diplomatic mission to Yemen in exile. I think that the Emiratis should be used effectively in interface and communication and working with southern groups in Yemen to unite these narratives between other factions that are countering the Houthis to unite in a more coherent fashion. And I think absolutely that the Sultanate of Oman and the state of Kuwait should absolutely be used in diplomatic affairs and being a third party that can interface with the Houthis. From an Iran standpoint, diplomatically, I think Iran and its proxies in Lebanon and in Gaza have been now on the defensive. They've been embarrassed. Their power has been greatly reduced. So now, from a perspective, as Iran looks at the Middle East, the Houthis have survived intact. It has been historically a very cheap way for Iran to continue to impose costs very cheaply, to continue to be a spoiler in the region. And so I think it would be very difficult for Iran to reduce its engagement with the Houthis that it has been because of the success it's had. So this is where I think now that these levers of diplomatic tools can continue to be engaged. I think also the context of, at least publicly, the public renewal of diplomatic relations between Iran and Saudi Arabia is very much something that the U.S. should use and has used and will continue to use, and that should be used in diplomatic engagement from Saudi Arabia directly with Iran to try to find solutions in Yemen. From an information standpoint, I already stated the number 1, 2, 3, etc. priorities for the next U.S. administration. That's stopping the conflicts in Gaza and Lebanon, which are a major source for Houthi legitimacy. I think there are also ways, too, that the U.S. can look at some of its authorities from an information operations campaign, from a cyber operations campaign of how to counter these Houthi narratives, and use other partners in the region to try to counter some of these narratives. But I also emphasize, too, again, that I think the U.S. role should not be as public, but try to give the face of, and take the U.S. face maybe a little bit more behind the scenes, particularly because of how much it's fueled the narrative of what the Houthis have used and weaponized that narrative for its own gain. I think from a military standpoint, the one I'll take the most time in explaining is I think that we could agree that the U.S. and what the United Kingdom has participated in these air campaigns, they have not been very effective. I agree that they have probably mitigated, or at least they disrupted some of the Houthi capabilities, their command and control capabilities of conducting attacks. They may have been short-term in affecting that, but I think largely a lot of the Houthi military capabilities to hit targets and to strike ships trying to transit the Bab el-Mandeb have largely remained intact. I don't think strategically their military capabilities are as such that they would be a strategic liability for Israel. I think that Israel can use other ports on the Mediterranean, and I think the Israeli strikes that have happened on Hodeidah, first and foremost, they don't greatly hurt the Houthis in their military capabilities. I think that they have hurt more the average Yemeni, and so I think this is a challenge the U.S. will have to approach in trying to keep Israel from attacking the Houthis in spite of all their desires of retribution and retaliation when the Houthis do attack. So I think this will be a big relationship that the United States will have to manage. I think next that we can describe the U.S.-led naval operations that have helped protect shipping in the Bab el-Mandeb or other parts of the Red Sea. This hasn't been a perfect solution, military solution. It's also very expensive when you use missiles or counter-drone missiles and other weapons that are very expensive compared to the low cost of the Houthi drones and other military equipment and means that the Houthi group movement has been using against these ships. It hasn't been perfect, but once again as well, it's something that would have to be maintained to remain in place. Those authorities need to remain in place to help try over time to maintain some level of confidence in the international shipping community and international community that the U.S. will continue to support the free flow of commerce. But it is not perfect. And I think also the danger that I have heard others mention is trying to greatly expand not only this task force that is called Prosperity Guardian, but other task forces that are in effect under these combined joint task forces that are based out of Bahrain, that the U.S. and other forces have take turns in providing support and military leadership. They also have authorities and policies where they will interdict some ships that are trying to smuggle various things in other parts of the region. But I think greatly expanding the amount of resources used is not a good use of resources. I don't see a time when the Joint Staff, the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, the senior military advisor to the President or to the Secretary of Defense, as the Joint Staff looks at global resources, I find it very difficult to imagine that the Chairman and the senior military advisor would recommend greatly expanding the U.S. naval resources to try to combat some of the smuggling. Once again, not a perfect solution, but I disagree with some others that have suggested expanding. I think also from a ground standpoint, from expanding or at least supporting the U.S. Or rather the Yemeni government, the Shar'iyya, the Yemeni government that's recognized. I think that the audience should understand from a U.S. perspective that many of the weapons or military products and solutions and equipment that the U.S. provided to Yemen in the past, the Houthis took this equipment over. This happened in the past. I think that this will be a constraint on the Yemeni government. And so I think the Yemeni government, I encourage it. I think that it needs to, I encourage the Yemeni government to build confidence with the U.S. government of maintaining systems and procedures in their system to account for all the equipment that the U.S. provides. And this will take place at very slow, maybe a very slow pace, less than others would want to do, or others would suggest. But I think this is vital if the U.S. is going to spend money on the U.S. or on the Yemeni government, that the Yemeni government has to provide confidence that it will be able to maintain accountability and maintain this equipment, and that it would not be turned over to other actors that could potentially in the future use this equipment against U.S. interests. I think also the U.S. will have to look at its rules of engagement, of what it targets, of who it targets in Yemen. This could be everything from looking at the Houthis and what forces are most important to their power, to their ability to export military power. It could be through their drones. It could be through striking sea targets in the Bab el-Mandeb. It could be on the ground. What units, what organizations, or what leadership do the Houthis use to control the population and to conduct these military operations? So I think the U.S. and others may have to look at intelligence operations of how to understand these groups, but also potentially how from a military standpoint these could target these abilities, at the same time balancing that the U.S. doesn't strike or have other humanitarian or issues or problems where it strikes areas that could exacerbate or worsen humanitarian situations. From an economic standpoint, I think that the administration, the Trump administration, when it comes, is definitely looking at a foreign terrorist organization sanctioning of the Houthi organization. I think this creates more challenges than effects, because it potentially has a greater effect on how humanitarian organizations provide humanitarian assistance to the average Yemeni. And so that's why I think the administration should look very, very carefully at the difference between targeted sanctions, economic sanctions, against Houthi individuals and Iranian individuals that facilitate the smuggling or transfer of weapons and money to the movement, as opposed to broad sanctions on the entire movement, on the entire Houthi movement, that could prohibit or make it difficult for humanitarian organizations to provide the very much needed aid for the Yemeni people. And that brings me to the final point. With humanitarian assistance, I think the U.S. and anything it does should not do any more harm than is already done against the Yemeni people, given how much they've suffered in the past many years of conflict. I think doing no harm also reduces the opportunities that the Houthi movement has to feed its narrative, to weaponize its narrative. It gives people, Yemenis in non-Houthi areas, at least something to hope for, and at least something that doesn't push them to support the Houthis over supporting U.S., Saudi, or other initiatives that are trying to bring some type of resolution to the conflict. I've spoken and I've exceeded my time. I want to thank the Mocha Center again for the opportunity to speak with you. I look forward to future speaking engagements. Thank you very much for the opportunity. This is not an all-inclusive discussion of any and all solutions and all problems and challenges. There are just a few things for you and the audience to consider, and for the Biden administration to consider in its final weeks in power, and as the new Trump administration comes in the first part of January 2025. Thank you very much.